The 2026 grid is all but finished, and there are a couple of interesting hot seats that will keep us entertained in the following period. With Lance Stroll's interest in the sport being approximately zero, there are certain beliefs that he could quit racing on his own, putting his father in a very tough situation to choose a driver as his replacement. Of course, Yuki Tsunoda's name will always lurk around wherever Honda participates. But is the scenario of Lance quitting and Yuki replacing him a realistic one? And if so, will it push away Lawrence from the sport? Considering that his son quit on his own, the situation in Aston Martin regarding Lance Stroll is getting more and more delicate. Despite Lawrence putting in a lot of hope for his son's championship dreams, the young Canadian is not showing anything that suggests he has interest in continuing to drive in phone. There is literally no doubt that no one would want to sign him if he were to exit on his own from Aston Martin. So if this is something that Lance commits to, it can only mean one thing. He is done with foe, and in that case, a very interesting name could come as the replacement. Yuki Tsunoda, the Japanese driver, is in a very muddy situation himself. He is last in the Drivers' Championship among drivers who have participated in the entire season. That's not boding well for a driver whose team is fourth in the Constructors' Championship and whose teammate is a four-time world champion sitting third in the drivers' standings. Be that as it may, Tsunoda's adaptability in the RB21 has proven to be all but effective. At this point, there is no doubt that he'd benefit from changing the environment a little bit and trying himself in another team, because what he's been going through in Red Bull has put a lot of strain on his career. Whether we like it or not, it's definitely worth noting that the car's characteristics are toxic to any young driver out there. At this point, it seems like Max is the only driver who's able to tame the wild nature of the RB21. And now that the team has started to listen to him more, it could be even worse news for Tsunoda as a Red Bull driver. But is the relationship with Honda good enough for him to be lobbied for if Lance is no longer part of the team from 2026 onwards? First of all, it's hard to tell whether Stroll would commit to this in the first place. The Canadian driver has shown a lack of interest in phone racing in media interviews and more or less in everything he participates in as a phone driver. But that itself is not really enough for us to make a solid conclusion that he is done with racing for his father's team. If we are to believe his father's statements, then we're going to see a lot from Lance in the following years, as his seat is guaranteed as long as Lawrence is in charge of the team. But that itself is not really what the investors and strategic partners of Aston Martin want to be looking at. Nepotism is not exactly the way to go if you want to have a successful partnership with your business accolades. And what's even more important is that you'd be relying on a 45-year-old driver to bring you home the first championship ever. That's if Honda's engines prove to be as competitive as Mercedes and Ferrari. And if that's really the case, then Honda could be lobbying to Lawrence about the services of Yuki. The Japanese manufacturer's president, Koji Watanabe, did state a couple of months ago that they will have an active vote on who gets to drive in the team in a similar fashion to what they had in Red Bull. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that he'd be lobbying to get Tsunoda in the seat, no matter what. But the relationship that they had and the fact that Yuki is in phone just because of Honda is a fact we cannot neglect. Still, Tsunoda is part of Red Bull as we speak, and despite the struggles, the goal of Laurent Mekies is to give him time to adapt to the newly created environment, with him being the boss of the team. Speaking further on this topic, Laurent said, "We need clear race samples at the front. The races are very clear. You get at least one good stint to gauge your performance." Tsunoda was within 0.2 of Max in Quan, and Max hasn't been slow in Monza. But the simple fact is that Tsunoda's performance in Red Bull has been all but satisfying. Sure, there have been many instances in which the team was the one to blame for it, but most of the time it was just pure lack of confidence from Yuki's side. That itself doesn't make him a bad driver. Elaborating further on this and shedding light on the cursed seat next to Max, Lawson said, "Isaac has done a very good job this year. To have a podium this season is pretty spectacular. He's doing a really great job. In some ways, I think a lot of drivers always feel ready for another step. He's doing all the right things right now. All in all, Tsunoda as a Red Bull driver is looking less likely day by day. And what's even more unfortunate is that he has to hope that the nepotistic factor in Aston Martin is going to break loose before he gets an opportunity to drive for them. Of course, that's really a far-fetched scenario as we speak. But now that there have been tons of reports about Lance's dissatisfaction with the sport in general and his lack of interest, one cannot help but wonder, Is he really worthy of an phone seat? Or did the time finally come for his father to look reality in the eyes and accept that his son won't be a champion in phone? All of the fancy buildings that he made back in Silverstone only for someone else to take the glory is not really what Lawrence had in mind when he entered phone with Aston Martin's consortium. But at the end of the day, it's nothing personal, just business.